I'm Mrs. Sugu from Nigeria. Like, to summarize actually what has been said about developed countries like ours, the problem is not legislation per se, it's implementation. Now, I want to ask, what is the stand of this Congress in using pressure groups to make the government implement some of the policies they have made? Because in our country, they like to be forced sometimes to be able to implement their policy. So I want to know the stand of the Congress in using pressure groups like youth, like labor unions, to sensitize the government to make them implement some of these policies, especially towards climate change.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. We have one more.
Thank you. I'm from Uganda. Dr. Socorro talked of tragedies. She said tragedy is tragedy and that we should turn it into an opportunity. At what time, at what point can we turn this into an opportunity? And secondly, she said we should have an entry point. Throughout her talk, I didn't see the entry point. Can she indicate the entry point? Thank you.
Thank you. So we are going to discuss the first two topics. Before we took a break, we had two papers presented, and some people needed time to prepare the answers. So we'll give answers and responses to the questions raised in the first session. And then you'll be ready to go back to those questions and comments raised later on. Okay, will that work? Or do you want to respond to that question and comments now? Yeah, you'll have some time to prepare. Okay, so there were many questions and comments from the first session. Let me see this. The first one, what are some of the lessons learned from the work of the Beijing Platform for Action in terms of gender mainstreaming that we can use in order to take forward the work on gender and CCA and gender and DRR? So Dr. Patricia Likuanen, will you be ready to answer this question?
Yes, I guess the more general questions were directed at me, but there were some questions earlier about the Philippines. The first had to do with asking me to share the experience on migration of the Philippines, particularly with East Timor. And if I attempt to do that, we will be here for several days because this has been a long experience. We have, this is the 100th year of Philippine migration to the United States, for instance, of workers, and it certainly has been a government policy and practice to send workers overseas since the early 70s. But let me just put together a few things that I feel are very important. First of all, let me say too that while the Philippines is often praised for the structures and programs we have for migrant workers, the government and of course the civil society will be the first to say that this is very inadequate and so much remains to be done. But at the very minimum, we feel, and let me advise the people from East Timor who are just starting this phenomenon or this experience in their country, that basically, yes, we will expect that if conditions are bad in the home country, people will be looking for employment overseas. When this happens, I think the government has to be very careful that they enter into very definite bilateral agreements with receiving countries that work favorably for our workers. We cannot just accept any jobs that are out there, and sometimes we are so eager to ease unemployment in our own country that we accept terms that are unfavorable to our workers. We have to be sure that there are services available to workers abroad, so the embassies have to develop their expertise in a wide range of things. This is no longer just diplomacy. This has to do with social services for the large number of workers that, certainly in our case, large number of Filipino workers abroad. We have to also be able to provide services for families left behind. In the early 70s, I started my career as a social scientist deploring the human costs, the social costs of overseas employment. And one of the major, I think, tragedies of it, or the areas of concern, would be the impact on families, where you have a whole generation of people, of Filipinos being raised in homes without one or sometimes both parents being away. So services for families left behind. But ultimately, I think ultimately what is called for by government and by private sector and everybody concerned is that we should provide real options here at home. Yes, times may be tough, but that has to be a major commitment, that the choice to go overseas is a real choice. So there has to be options here at home. There was a question also about gender budgets. And there I must say, and with all due apologies to, I'm sure, the government, local government of Nueva Ecija, trying hard to spend their gender budget well and wisely, I really find it very difficult to understand how groups would not be able to know how to spend their GAD budget or their gender budget, because the need is so great. There is so much that can be done for women. So how on earth can they spend this for totally irrelevant activities? I'm sure that's not the case in Nueva Ecija, but that has been reported that they use it for ballroom dancing and so forth. I like to think that's the exception to the rule. The secret here is just a genuine interest and involvement in women's issues, and you will find you will have a whole list of things that you can spend that money on. With regard to gender mainstreaming, I think the idea was really very good. The whole point here is that the responsibility for doing women's work or work for gender equality should not be left basically to women's organizations, to the women's national machinery. It should be done by all of government. So this type of expertise, this type of activity should be mainstreamed in all agencies of the government. And so that was the whole idea behind it. But what the misuse that came about was really when basically gender came to mean, or gender mainstreaming came to mean anything and everything. And the focus on women was lost. Agencies would remove their gender experts and just say they're social development experts. Once they become social development experts, they can do so many other things. And so we felt that women and women's projects were being shortchanged. The secret to gender mainstreaming is to have strong entities and strong machineries, strong organizations which focus on women. Because a strong national machinery or a strong women's desk in an agency will be a major tool for gender mainstreaming, because they can train other people to do women's work. I think I'll stop there and wait for the others to come in.